Look at her, a cracked vessel in a room of crystal. No man desires you, Elara. Why did you even come? The royal solstice ball was always intended to be a spectacle of light, but for Elara, it felt like the onset of a long, cold winter. While the grand ballroom of the lunar reach pack shimmered with thousands of enchanted candles and the scent of expensive lilies, Elara stood tucked into a corner, her presence muted by a dress of dull charcoal silk. Beside her, her sister Sloane was a sun to her shadow. Sloane's gown was spun from threads of actual gold, her laugh a melodic chime that drew every high-ranking bachelor in the territory like moths to a flame. For Elara, every glance from the crowd felt like a needle prick. She carried a disfigurement, faint, swirling marks that climbed her neck and disappeared beneath her hair, the result of a childhood accident that the pack healers could never explain. In a world where physical perfection and wolf strength were the only currencies, Elara was considered a cracked vessel. She had spent 19 years listening to her father, the Alpha, sigh in disappointment when his gaze fell upon her, and her sister's constant, sharp-tongued reminders that she was a burden to their bloodline. Tonight was supposed to be the pinnacle of Elara's misery. She had watched Sloane flirt shamelessly with the man Elara secretly loved, only to have Sloane turn to the entire court and loudly proclaim Elara's unworthiness. The laughter of the nobility had been louder than the music, a jagged sound that confirmed Elara's deepest fear, that she was invisible to everyone except those who wished to mock her. But the atmosphere shifted the moment the heavy obsidian doors swung open. The air didn't just chill. It vibrated with a raw, ancient power that made every wolf in the room drop their head in instinctive submission. King Valerius, the wounded sovereign of the North, had arrived. He was a man of scars and silence, a ruler who had rejected 1,000 beautiful highborn ladies. As his dark, predatory gaze swept over the room, the superficial beauty of the lunar reach pack seemed to wither. When his eyes finally locked onto Elara, the world stopped. He didn't see a cracked vessel, he saw a mirror to his own soul. The moment he stepped past the golden Sloane and toward the girl in charcoal, the power dynamic of the kingdom began to shift forever.
Welcome to Alpha King Romance Diaries, where passion meets power and love always reigns supreme. This channel is your escape into powerful love stories, deep emotions, and irresistible alpha energy. Hit subscribe and join the kingdom. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned, the fun is just getting started.
The air in the dressing chamber was thick with the scent of jasmine oil and the suffocating weight of Elara's own invisibility. She stood perfectly still as the maid pulled the laces of her charcoal silk gown, the fabric coarse and heavy compared to the gossamer gold draped over her sister across the room. Elara's dress was designed with a high, stiff collar and long, tapered sleeves. A velvet cage intended to ensure not a single inch of her shame was visible to the aristocratic eyes of the lunar reach pack. "Careful with the pins," Sloane snapped, though the maid was working on Elara, not her. Sloane stood before the triptych mirror, preening like a bird of paradise. She turned, her golden gown catching the light and throwing shimmering reflections against the stone walls. "Though I suppose it doesn't matter. You could be draped in starlight and they would still only see the cracked vessel beneath. That charcoal suits you, Elara. It matches the soot of the kitchens where you belong." Elara kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers tracing the faint, raised patterns of the marks that climbed her collarbone. They felt warm today, pulsing with a low, rhythmic heat she had never felt before. "It is just for one night, Sloane. I only wish to see the ceremony." Sloane let out a sharp, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "To see the ceremony? Or to moon over the beta's son? Honestly, Elara, have some dignity. You are a stain on this family's reputation. Every time someone looks at those wretched marks on your neck, they remember that our bloodline isn't as pure as father claims. You aren't a guest tonight. You are a liability." The heavy oak door groaned open, and Alpha Silas stepped into the room. He didn't look at Elara at first. His eyes, cold and calculating, rested on Sloane with a glimmer of pride. "You look radiant, my daughter. You will secure our future tonight." Then his gaze shifted to the corner. The pride vanished, replaced by a weary, sharp-edged disappointment. He didn't move toward Elara. He didn't offer a father's blessing. You, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low warning. You will stay in the shadows of the gallery. You are to speak to no one. If the king or any of the visiting alphas so much as glance your way, you are to turn your head. I will not have your deformity haunting the edges of my daughter's triumph. Do you understand? Yes, father, Elara whispered, the words tasting like ash. Good, ensure your collar is straight. If I see even a hint of those markings, you will be sent to the cells before the first dance ends. He turned on his heel, his heavy cape sweeping the floor. Sloane leaned in close as she followed him out, her perfume cloying and sweet. Don't look so tragic, Elara, she hissed into her ear. The dark is where things like you are meant to live. Left alone in the echoing room, Elara reached up to touch the stiff silk of her collar. The marks beneath it throbbed again, a silent, burning rebellion against the charcoal shroud she was forced to wear. The heavy obsidian doors of the grand ballroom did not merely open. They seemed to groan under the weight of an arrival that the world had been holding its breath for. The lively cadence of the violins faltered, the notes tapering off into a discordant, dying echo that left the room in a state of sudden, ringing vacuum. In the wake of the silence, a coldness swept through the hall, not the chill of a winter draft, but the ancient, predatory frost that emanated from a true apex. King Valerius stepped across the threshold, and the very air seemed to densen around him. He did not possess the polished, preening grace of the local lords. He moved with the lethal, heavy economy of a mountain storm. His tall, broad-shouldered frame was draped in charcoal furs and dark leather, his chest scarred and unyielding behind a breastplate of black iron. Beside him, Alpha Silas, a man who usually commanded the room with a booming voice and a heavy hand, seemed to shrink, his posture losing its sharp edges, his eyes flickering with an instinctive, panicked submission. As Valerius walked, the high-ranking bachelors and local alphas instinctively stepped back, creating a wide, hollow path. To see them together was to see the difference between a house dog and a wolf of the tundra. Their gold-stitched tunics and perfumed collars suddenly looked like the costumes of children playing at power. Valerius's face was a map of hard lines and silver-white scars, his jaw set in a permanent expression of grim sovereignty. His eyes, a terrifying shade of molten slate, did not settle on the bowing dignitaries or the blushing debutantes who fanned themselves in his wake. High in the shadows of the gallery, Elara leaned against the stone railing, her breath hitching in her chest. From this distance, she should have felt safe, yet the king's presence pulled at her like a tide. The marks on her neck, hidden beneath the suffocating silk of her collar, began to burn with a fierce, rhythmic heat, pulsing in time with the heavy thud of his boots on the marble below. Sloane stood at the foot of the dais, her gold dress shimmering as she tilted her head to reveal the line of her throat, her lips parted in a practiced, seductive smile. She was prepared to be the sun that caught the king's eye, but as Valerius reached the center of the hall, he stopped. He didn't look at the throne, and he didn't look at the Alpha's golden daughter. He tilted his head back, his nostrils flaring as he drew in the scent of the room, a scent of lilies, wine, and fear, and then something else. Something ancient. The king's gaze began to climb, sweeping past the tapestries and the pillars, moving toward the dark, forgotten corners of the upper gallery, where a girl in charcoal silk tried to disappear into the stone. Driven by a thirst she couldn't ignore, Elara slipped from the safety of the gallery shadows, moving toward the long refreshment tables draped in white linen. She kept her head low, a ghost in charcoal weaving through the vibrant plumage of the court. She only needed a sip of water to cool the strange, celestial fire burning beneath her skin, but as she reached for a crystal carafe, a hand clamped firmly onto her wrist. "I thought I smelled something dusty," Sloane hissed, her voice loud enough to turn heads. She stood with a cluster of highborn ladies and the Beta's son, their faces lit with the cruel glow of privilege. With a sharp tug, Sloane pulled Elara's arm, forcing her into the center of the semicircle. "Look at her," Sloane laughed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a death knell. "My sister, the wallflower, trying to drink from the same glass as the king. Tell me, Elara, did you think a fancy dress would hide the rot? Did you think the charcoal would make people forget what lies beneath?" "Sloane, please," Elara whispered, her face burning. "I am only thirsty." "You are thirsty for attention you will never receive," Sloane mocked, reaching out with a jagged fingernail to hook the edge of Elara's stiff silk collar. She yanked it downward just enough to expose the beginning of the swirling, iridescent marks on Elara's neck. A collective gasp of feigned horror rippled through the onlookers. "Look at this deformity," Sloane declared, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Father was right to hide you. You are a cracked vessel, Elara, a broken thing. No man in this room, not even the lowest rogue, would ever desire a woman who carries a curse on her skin. You are a stain on the lunar reach, and tonight you are nothing more than a joke for the king's entertainment." The laughter started low, a titter from the beta's son, before swelling into a roar of mockery. The court ladies hid their smiles behind lace fans, their eyes filled with a lethal pity that was worse than hatred. Elara felt the weight of their collective scorn like a physical blow, pinning her to the marble floor. She looked around the circle, searching for a single sympathetic face, but found only the cold, hard mirrors of people who felt superior in her presence. "Go back to your shadows, little bird," Sloane sneered, leaning in close so her breath fanned Elara's ear. "The king is looking for a queen, not a gargoyle." As the laughter crested, Elara felt the marks on her neck flare with a sudden, blinding heat. For the first time, she didn't want to hide. She wanted to burn the room to ash. But then, the laughter died, not because Sloane had finished, but because the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots was approaching, and the air in the room was turning to ice. The silence that followed the king's approach was absolute, a crushing vacuum that swallowed the remnants of the court's laughter. Valerius moved through the center of the ballroom, his presence a dark tide that forced the nobility to retreat toward the walls. The local alphas stood like statues, their breath hitching as the sovereign of the north neared, but he did not grant them so much as a glance. Sloane, recovered from her shock and fueled by a desperate, soaring ambition, stepped directly into his path. She smoothed the golden silk over her hips, her eyes wide and shimmering with practiced vulnerability. "Your Majesty," she purred, her voice a honeyed caress that broke the stillness. "I am Sloane of the Lunar Reach. I hope our humble hospitality has been to your liking. Perhaps you would honor me with a turn across the floor." The court held its breath. It was the moment every lady had prepared for, the chance to catch the king's eye and secure a throne of ice. Valerius stopped. His gaze fell upon Sloane, cold and clinical, as if he were examining a piece of colorful glass. He did not speak. He did not offer his hand. After a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, he simply stepped around her, his shoulder brushing past her golden sleeve as if she were nothing more than a pillar of salt. A choked gasp rippled through the hall. Sloane stood frozen, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson as her rejection echoed in the silence. But Valerius was already moving on. Like a predator tracking a scent through a forest of distractions, he ignored the preening daughters of the High Lords. He ignored the Beta's sisters who draped themselves in his line of sight, and he ignored the Alpha's wife who tried to offer a toast. His nostrils flared, his head tilting slightly. To the rest of the pack, the air smelled of perfume, sweat, and expensive wine. To Valerius, it was dominated by something impossible, the scent of cold starlight, ozone, and ancient, poolsing earth. It was a scent that had haunted his dreams and lived in the marrow of his bones, a scent that shouldn't exist in a pack as shallow as the Lunar Reach. He tracked it with a terrifying focus, his boots striking the marble with the rhythm of a war drum. He pushed past a cluster of shocked elders, his silver slate eyes fixed on the shadows near the refreshment table. There, trembling against the white linen, was the girl in the charcoal shroud. The court watched in stunned bewilderment as their king, the man who had just discarded the most beautiful women in the territory, finally stopped. He stood before the cracked vessel, his shadow falling over her like a dark, protective wing, his silence finally broken by a low, vibrating growl of recognition. Elara kept her head bowed, her vision blurred by hot, stinging tears. She waited for the king to join in the mockery, to demand why such a broken creature was permitted to breathe the same air as his nobility. She could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and terrifying, pinning her to the spot. The marks on her neck were no longer just warm, they were screaming, a frantic, rhythmic pulsing that vibrated through her entire frame. "Look at me." The command was not loud, but it possessed the resonance of a shifting tectonic plate. It was a voice that brooked no disobedience. Trembling, Elara lifted her chin. She expected to see disgust in those molten slate eyes, but instead, she found a raw, burning hunger that made her heart stop. Valerius wasn't looking at her charcoal dress or her tear-stained face. He was staring at the sliver of iridescent skin peeking from her collar with the intensity of a man who had finally found the North Star. "Your Majesty," Alpha Silas stammered, rushing forward to bridge the distance. "I apologize for this. Isor, my daughter has no sense of propriety. Elara, go to your rooms at once." Valerius didn't even turn his head. He raised a single hand, and the Alpha of the lunar reach was silenced as effectively as if his throat had been cut. The king stepped closer, entering Elara's personal space until she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing the skin just above her collar, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her that nearly buckled her knees. "You speak of beauty as if it were a thing of paint and silk," Valerius said, his voice dropping to a low growl that echoed in every corner of the silent hall. He turned his head then, his gaze sweeping over the golden Sloane and the trembling nobility with utter disdain. "You call her broken? You call her a cracked vessel." His hand moved to the nape of her neck, his fingers firm and possessive. He pulled her forward, not with violence, but with a terrifying, absolute claim. "I have searched every corner of the 4 kingdoms," he boomed, his voice rising until the chandeliers rattled. "I have walked through 1,000 halls filled with your preening daughters and your empty smiles, and in all that time, I have found only one woman whose soul matches the steel of my own, only one woman whose blood calls to the stars." He looked back at Elara, his expression fierce and unyielding. "I am Valerius of the North, and I do not seek a doll to sit upon my throne. I seek a queen." He turned to the shocked assembly, his hand never leaving Elara's neck. "Behold your new sovereign. From this moment, she is under my protection. Any word spoken against her is a word spoken against the crown. Any hand raised toward her will be severed. She is mine, and she is the only woman in this room worthy of the name." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a shattered world. Sloane's face was a mask of ashen disbelief, and Sila's looked as if he had been struck dumb. Amidst the wreckage of their expectations, the king leaned down, his forehead pressing against Elara's in a gesture of intimate, public devotion. "Don't be afraid, little star," he whispered against her skin. "The darkness is over, we're going home." The journey to the north was a blur of thundering hooves and the scent of crushed pine. Elara sat before Valerius on his massive warhorse, encased within the iron circle of his arms. The transition from the stifling, perfumed air of the lunar reach to the sharp, thin atmosphere of the Iron Peaks was like waking from a fevered dream. As they ascended the jagged slopes toward the citadel of stars, the world grew quiet, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of snow and the distant, lonely cry of a mountain eagle. The citadel was unlike any fortress Elara had ever seen. Built of obsidian and white marble, it seemed to grow directly out of the mountain's summit, its spires reaching up to pierce the very belly of the cosmos. As they passed through the heavy silver gates, the air grew thinner and colder, yet Elara felt a strange, intoxicating vitality surging through her veins. Valerius dismounted and reached up, his hands catching her waist with effortless strength to set her on the ground. He didn't let go immediately, his slate-gray eyes scanning her face with a quiet, burning intensity. "The mountain air is honest, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low vibration in the crisp silence. "It strips away the lies of the lowlands." As she followed him into the heart of the fortress, a great hall with a ceiling made of reinforced glass that looked directly into the swirling nebula of the night sky, a startling sensation seized her. The stiff, charcoal silk of her collar felt suddenly, impossibly tight. Beneath the fabric, the marks on her neck and shoulders weren't just warm anymore, they were humming. She stepped toward a tall, narrow mirror framed in frost iron. With trembling fingers, she undid the silver clasps of her high collar, letting the heavy fabric fall away. Elara gasped, her hands flying to her throat. The swirling disfigurement that had been the bane of her existence was no longer a dull, raised brown. In the thin, celestial air of the citadel, the marks had turned a brilliant, iridescent silver. They pulsed with a rhythmic, ethereal light, glowing in sync with the distant stars visible through the ceiling. The patterns weren't scars. They were intricate, ancient sigils that seemed to shift and dance beneath her skin like liquid moonlight. It's glowing, she whispered, her voice trembling as she watched the silver light spill over her collarbone, illuminating the dark hall. Valerius stepped into the reflection behind her, his large, scarred hand coming to rest on her shoulder, his skin dark against her radiant markings. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man watching the sun rise after a lifetime of darkness. They called it a curse because they were too blind to see a crown, he said, his reflection meeting hers. In the valley, you were a cracked vessel. Here, at the roof of the world, you are the light the stars have been waiting for. The silver light emanating from Elara's skin cast long, shimmering shadows against the obsidian walls, turning the private solar into a chamber of starlight. She stared at her reflection, mesmerized by the way the sigils on her neck ebbed and flowed like a tide made of mercury. The shame she had carried for 19 years felt suddenly, strangely light, a heavy cloak she was finally allowed to drop. Valerius moved to a heavy stone pedestal in the center of the room, where an ancient tome bound in star metal lay open. He beckoned her closer. Your father told you that you were the result of an accident, a fluke of nature that left you broken. He lied, Elara, not because he hated you, but because he feared what you represented. Elara traced the illustrations in the book, drawings of wolves with fur like fallen snow and eyes that held the constellations. The markings on the page were an exact match for the patterns glowing on her skin. What am I? She whispered. You are the last of the star-marked, Valerius said, his voice thick with a reverence she had never heard from a man before. Centuries ago, the star-marked were the soul of the northern territories. They weren't just shifters, they were seers, the only ones capable of tethering our wild spirits to the ancient magic of the earth. When the great wars came, they were hunted for their power, forced into hiding until their blood was thought to have thinned into nothingness. He turned to her, the scars on his face softened by the silver glow of her presence. My lineage, the Iron Peak Alphas, swore a blood oath to protect the star-marked. Without a star-marked mate, my line is destined to burn out, consumed by the very darkness we fight. I have spent a decade scouring the territories, looking for a scent that shouldn't exist, a scent of cold ozone and ancient light. Elara's breath hitched. You weren't looking for a queen, you were looking for a savior. I was looking for my equal, Valerius corrected, stepping into her space and taking her hands in his. His touch was no longer just grounding, it felt like a completion. The lunar reach hid you away, treating your power as a deformity because they knew that if the North ever realized who you were, their petty games of politics would be over. You are the key to the survival of my people, and the only light capable of guiding me out of the shadows. He lifted her hand, kissing the palm where a small silver star was beginning to form beneath the skin. They told you no man desired you because they were terrified of the man who would. I didn't claim you at that ball to humiliate your sister, Elara. I claimed you because my soul recognized its other half the moment I stepped into that room. The night of the winter solstice arrived with a sky so clear it felt as though the veil between worlds had worn thin. At the highest altar of the citadel, a circular dais open to the heavens, Valerius stood beside Elara. The air was a razor of cold, yet Elara felt a subterranean heat rising through the soles of her feet. She was no longer wearing the charcoal silk of her shame. She stood in a simple slip of white linen, her skin already shimmering with an anticipatory hum. The moon reaches its zenith, Valerius whispered, his hand resting on the small of her back. Do not hold it back, Elara. Let the stars claim what is theirs. As the moon aligned perfectly with the obsidian spire above them, a pillar of pure, silver light descended from the heavens, engulfing Elara. The sensation was not one of pain, but of a violent, beautiful expansion. The silver sigils on her neck and shoulders ignited, the light spreading like wildfire across her limbs. The scars that had once made her a pariah began to shift, weaving themselves into a complex, luminous tapestry that covered her body in swirling, celestial geometry. Then came the sound, a crystalline ring that echoed across the mountain peaks. Elara's human form began to ripple and stretch, her bones snapping and reforming not with the jagged agony of a common wolf, but with the fluid grace of light turning into matter. A blinding flash of mercury-white radiance forced Valerius to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the girl was gone. Standing upon the dais was a creature of ancient prophecy. She was a wolf of staggering size, her fur not white, but a brilliant metallic silver that seemed to be woven from moonbeams. Every movement she made sent ripples of starlight through her coat, and when she opened her eyes, they were two glowing pools of molten indigo, containing the depth of 1,000 galaxies. She was breathtaking, a physical manifestation of the cosmic balance. The deformity that Sloane had mocked was now revealed as the blueprint of a goddess. Elara lifted her head to the moon and let out a howl that was not a cry of hunger, but a song of sovereignty. It was a sound that traveled down the mountain, through the forests, and across the borders of the lunar reach, announcing to every soul who had ever doubted her that the star-marked queen had ascended. Valerius stepped forward, his own wolf packing beneath his skin in restless adoration. He knelt before her, pressing his forehead against her silver fur. She was no longer a cracked vessel. She was the most beautiful, powerful force in the north, and the world was about to tremble at her feet. The gates of the citadel groaned open to admit a delegation that smelled of desperation and wood smoke. Alpha Silas and Sloane arrived not as the proud rulers of the lowlands, but as beggars. A brutal blight had struck the lunar reach, withering their crops and silencing their hunters, leaving the pack on the precipice of starvation. As they were led into the great hall, they kept their heads low, their fine silks now frayed and dusted with the grime of the mountain passes. "We seek an audience with the Alpha King," Silas's voice rasped, his eyes darting toward the empty throne. Beside him, Sloane looked gaunt, her golden beauty tarnished by the harsh reality of hunger. She still clutched her pride like a tattered shawl, but her hands trembled. "We have come to offer our loyalty in exchange for life." Loyalty is a heavy word for those who discard their own blood. A voice resonated from the shadows behind the throne. Valerius stepped into the light, his presence as cold and immovable as the obsidian walls. But he did not sit. Instead, he stepped aside, bowing his head in a gesture of profound reverence that made Silas's heart skip a beat. From the darkness emerged a woman who seemed to be carved from starlight itself. Elara moved with a fluid, lethal grace, her hair a shimmering river of silver that cascaded over a gown of iridescent silk. The marks on her neck and collarbone were no longer hidden. They glowed with a soft, pulsing indigo light, marking her as something divine. Sloane let out a strangled gasp, her knees buckling as she stared at the sister she had called a gargoyle. "Elara," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of horror and awe. It can't be." Silas fell to his knees, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of his sin. The cracked vessel he had tried to bury was now the sovereign of the very power that could save his people. The girl he had forbidden from the light was now the source of it. Elara stopped before them, her gaze cool and distant, like the surface of a frozen lake. She didn't look at them with the rage they expected, which was somehow more terrifying. She looked at them as if they were ghosts of a life she had long since outgrown. "You come to the citadel seeking mercy," Elara said, her voice carrying the weight of the mountain winds. "Please," Sloane sobbed, reaching out a hand before the king's low growl forced her to recoil. "We didn't know. Father, tell her. We didn't know what you were." "You knew what I was," Elara countered softly, stepping forward until the silver light of her skin illuminated Sloane's terrified face. "You knew I was a sister. You knew I was a daughter, and you decided that was not enough to merit your kindness." She looked at her father, who could not even meet her eyes. The power in the room shifted, the celestial energy in her blood humming in response to their fear. The girl who had once hidden in the shadows was gone. In her place stood the star-marked queen, holding the fate of her enemies in her glowing, radiant hands. The morning of the coronation broke not with a typical sunrise, but with a celestial alignment that set the very air of the Iron Peaks on fire. Thousands had gathered in the valley below the citadel, wolves from the furthest reaches of the north, mountain clans who had lived in exile for generations, and even the humbled remnants of the lunar reach. They had all come to witness the return of the light. Elara stood upon the high balcony, overlooking the vast expanse of her new kingdom. She wore a mantle of starlight-spun wool, but the true crown was the radiance that now emanated from within her. The silver sigils on her skin had stabilized into a permanent, breathtaking glow, a map of her power that she no longer sought to hide. Valerius stepped out to join her, his dark presence the perfect anchor to her brilliance. In his hands, he carried a circlet of ancient star metal, forged in the fires of the first alphas. The crowd fell into a silence so profound the only sound was the snapping of the banners in the wind. For too long, the North has walked in shadow, Valerius declared, his voice carrying like thunder across the peaks. We have forgotten the ancient bond that tied us to the stars. We have allowed fear to call beauty a curse and strength a deformity. He turned to Elara, his eyes reflecting the indigo fire of her own. But the cycle is restored. The star-marked has returned. As he placed the circlet upon her brow, a pillar of silver light erupted from the citadel's spire, piercing the sky and scattering the clouds. Elara felt the collective heartbeat of the North tether itself to her soul. She reached out her hands, and the iridescent energy of her bloodline flowed outward, a shimmering wave of restoration that swept across the lands. In that moment, the blighted fields of the lunar reach began to stir with new life, and the broken spirits of her people were mended. She looked out at the sea of faces, and there in the front row she saw Silas and Sloane. They were kneeling, their heads bowed in genuine, trembling reverence. There was no anger in Elara's heart, only the vast, cool clarity of the mountains. She had moved beyond their small cruelties. She was a sovereign of the cosmos now. I am the light in the dark, Elara whispered, yet her voice reached every ear in the territory. I am the memory of the earth and the hope of the sky. We are whole. A roar of acclaim rose from the valley, a sound of joy that shook the foundations of the mountains. Beside her, Valerius took her hand, his thumb tracing the star mark on her palm. The era of the cracked vessel was dead. The reign of the Silver Queen had begun, and as long as the stars burned in the heavens, her light would never fade.
If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Don't forget to leave a comment and tell us what you think about the story. We love hearing from you. Your support helps keep this channel alive and bringing you amazing, interesting, and powerful alpha stories. Thank you for being here.